Hi there, my friends. Welcome back. My name is Stephanie Safarian, and you're listening to episode 460 of Sustainable Minimalists. This is a listener-supported show all about intentional and eco-friendly minimalist living. On today's show, we're discussing dopamine. Dopamine, of course, is that feel-good neurotransmitter that keeps us coming back to our habits, whether they're good or bad, over and over again. We're also seeking to use what we learn about dopamine today so that we can live more intentional lives that are aligned with our values. Now, before we get there, we have two quick housekeeping issues. Number one, if you're tuning in because I told you this was going to be an episode about pesticides on Tuesday, I just want to say that episode is not today. I had a scheduling conflict with the guest. I could have put it out, but I just didn't want to put out a subpar episode, essentially. I thought I would hold it till next week and get it perfect, or as close to perfect as I can get. So pesticides episode is going to be next week. Stay tuned for that. I still stand by my original statement. It is a must listen episode, but you're going to have to wait one more week so that you get the best episode possible. That's housekeeping issue number one. Housekeeping issue number two is about book club. I will be sending out an email this week. So by Friday at log off time, which for me is 4 p.m. Eastern. By Friday, I will be sending out an email to supporters with a poll about what time on June 3rd shall we meet. Be on the lookout for that email by Friday at log off time. And if you don't get it, please email me. There's a problem and we need to troubleshoot. Okay, so those are my two housekeeping issues. Now let's get into today's episode. Yes, we Homo Sapiens, you know it's true. We are notorious for avoiding pain and seeking out pleasure. In fact, we humans have gotten really darn good at this. We have transformed our planet from a place of scarcity to a place of overwhelming abundance. There are, of course, environmental consequences associated with that, which we'll touch on in a bit. But we these days have opportunities to flood our brains with that feel-good dopamine at every turn. Heck, in every pocket even. We all have cell phones with the internet, social media, so dopamine-inducing. Well, I recently read a book. It was called Dopamine Nation, Finding Balance in the Age of Indulgence. And in that book, by the way, I linked to it in the show notes, but in that book, author Dr. Anna Lembke makes the point that there's a problem. There's a big problem with our collective desire to obtain pleasure and avoid pain. The problem is that our brains are not evolved to work optimally in this world of plenty. Dr. Lemke even goes so far to say that we are drowning in dopamine, and the real-life effect of drowning in dopamine is that we need more reward to feel pleasure, and we need less injury to feel pain. Whew, I know. So as we discuss dopamine today, I'd love it if you thought to yourself, what is your dopamine-inducing habit? What's your bad habit? Dare I even use the word addiction, perhaps? Do you have an addiction that you are nurturing? Maybe it's your cell phone. Maybe it's donuts. Maybe it's mine. Maybe it's wine. Maybe it's nicotine. Maybe it's over-exercise. Whatever it is, I'd like you to keep it in mind today as you listen and ask yourself, is this a benign habit, or are we crossing the line into something that is potentially encroaching on our desire and our needs to live intentional lives? So let's get into the science of dopamine first. This is where I really get to geek out, and I'm so excited about it. But we're going to talk about our brains, and we're going to talk about neurons. Brain cells are called neurons. Neurons talk to each other via electrical signals and neurotransmitters at the synapses. A synapse is essentially the space between neurons. So imagine, okay, I'm going to make this as simple as possible for everybody to understand. Imagine that you and your friend, it's a gorgeous day and you're outside in your backyard and you're playing catch. You're standing very far away from each other and you want to tell your friend something, but your friend's too far away. If you yell it, they won't hear you. So you write your message on a ball and you throw the ball to your friend. In this metaphor, it's a terrible metaphor, but just stay with me. In this metaphor, you are one neuron. Your friend is another neuron. The space between you is the synapse, and the ball is the neurotransmitter. The ball is the dopamine. Now, dopamine was first identified as a neurotransmitter back in 1957. And yes, dopamine is the feel-good neurotransmitter. The brain releases dopamine when we eat food that we crave, or when we have sex, or when we drink wine, or when we do anything that is pleasurable. Dopamine boosts our mood, boosts our motivation, boosts our attention, and even helps us with learning. Dopamine creates reward-seeking loops. And so in this sense, people will repeat pleasurable behaviors because, again, dopamine is also related to motivation. So if something feels good, we are motivated to join that pleasurable loop, right? That reward-seeking loop. Maybe checking Instagram multiple times an hour is seeking and hoping for that pleasure through a boost of dopamine between neurons. Now, it's important to note here that dopamine is not the only neurotransmitter involved in reward processing, but most scientists do believe it is among the most important. Dopamine is used to measure the addictive potential of any behavior or of any drug. And so the more dopamine that gets released into the brain's reward pathway, and the faster your brain releases the dopamine, the more addictive the habit or the drug or the behavior is said to be. So let's talk about some addictive habits or behaviors. All right. So this is all due to studies on rats. Chocolate. Let's start with chocolate. Chocolate in the lab was found to increase the basal output of dopamine in the brain by 55%. In rats, okay? Chocolate increases the basal output of dopamine 55%. Sex increases that basal output of dopamine 100%. Nicotine, 150%. Cocaine, 225%. And amphetamines like speed. Amphetamines increase the basal output of dopamine in the brain by 1,000%. 1,000%. Now, here's where things get interesting. Pleasure and pain are processed in overlapping brain regions, and they work in balance. They're on a seesaw. So I want you to picture a seesaw. Go back to your childhood. You're on a seesaw. Pleasure is on one side of the seesaw, and pain is on the other. When we experience pleasure, dopamine gets released into our reward pathway, and the seesaw dips to the side of pleasure. The more our balance tips and the faster that seesaw tips toward pleasure, the more pleasure we feel, right? But, and it's a big but, our brains like balance. Our brains like to exist in a space of equilibrium, of homeostasis. Our brain does not want to be tipped to either side for very long. So guess what happens? Our brain's self-regulating mechanisms will kick in to make it level again. This is a brain reflex. You don't consciously know that your brain is doing it, but it's doing it. Dr. Lemke, in her book, Dopamine Nation, uses the metaphor of gremlins. She says that gremlins come in and they all jump on the pain side of the seesaw. And so then they tip the seesaw back to equilibrium, homeostasis. This is called opponent process theory. What goes up must come down. But in this case, what goes down, the pleasure side of the seesaw, must go back up. Any prolonged or repeated departures from hedonic or affective neutrality have a cost. That's opponent process theory. Now, what does this mean in real life consequences? You're probably thinking to yourself, okay, great. I'm so happy to learn all this about what's happening in my brain, but it doesn't really translate into real life consequences. Well, I've got you. With exposure to prolonged and repeated pleasurable stimuli, our capacity to tolerate pain decreases and our threshold for experiencing pain increases. Our brain is adapted for a world of scarcity. Think about it. If we didn't experience hunger, we wouldn't seek out food, right? We need duality in all things. And our brains are not evolved for this world of plenty. This means that our seesaws in our brains are wildly out of whack. We have raised our neural set point with repeated pleasures, which means we have become endless strivers who are very rarely satisfied. Now, I must mention neuroadaptation here, right? With repeated exposure to the same pleasure stimulus, the initial deviation to the side of pleasure gets weaker and shorter, and the after response to the side of pain gets stronger and longer. So I'll say that another way so that we're all on the same page. With repetition, the brain gremlins on the side of pain get bigger and faster and more numerous, and we need more and more of our drug or habit of choice to tilt the seesaw. So if you love donuts, it may have started out that one donut in the morning was enough to really tip the seesaw towards pleasure. But as you may know, one donut over time, after repeated exposure to the same pleasure stimulus, the pleasure stimulus, of course, being the donut, one donut after a month, 2 months, a year, one donut's not going to do it for you anymore. The gremlins that are jumping on the pain side to bring the seesaw back to equilibrium, they're getting bigger and more numerous, and they jump on the seesaw way faster than they did your first time getting that donut, let's say. So how did we get here? How did we get here? Our seesaws are wildly out of whack, by and large, collectively. Of course, how did we get here? Well, I've got a bunch of reasons, but before we even go into the reasons, I must say that there are, of course, countless systemic and environmental factors like systemic racism, like poverty, like having a disability and an ableist society. I could go on and on. Living is really darn hard for a lot of people, and living is even harder for some of us. That's what I'm trying to say here. So if living is really hard, and harder for some people, they may be more likely to engage in pleasure-seeking behaviors. Saying that right off the bat. Donuts, social media scrolling, whatever the habit may be, okay? There are gigantic factors at play. In addition to those gigantic factors, we need to remember that we human beings, we Homo Sapiens, we tend to focus on short-term rewards, quick pleasures, quick fixes over what's best for us long term. We've talked about this on the show before many times. I've linked to a few episodes in the show notes if you want to refresh your memory or perhaps you missed them the first time. But the fact that we love instant gratification as a species is compounded by the fact that high dopamine goods mess with our ability to delay gratification, right? If we know we're going to feel really darn good after going on that shopping spree, let's say, it makes it even harder for us to delay gratification and perhaps not go on that shopping spree or perhaps temper that shopping spree. So I'm saying here, evolutionarily, we're not built to focus on long-term rewards. That's reason number one. Reason number two, on a societal level, we have an awful lot of time for leisure these days. Again, not everyone, but collectively. We have industrialized agriculture. We have industrialized manufacturing. Many of us have extra funds to outsource whatever we want, the ironing, the dry cleaning, any domestic chore we don't want to do. We can outsource that if we have the funds. And so, yes, we have a growing amount of leisure time these days. Just before the Civil War, so 1860s, I believe, if my history is correct, the workday in either agriculture or industry consisted of 10 to 12-hour days, 6 days a week, 51 weeks out of the year. Of course, some immigrants, slaves especially, they worked significantly more. But today, the amount of leisure time in the United States has increased by 5.1% between 1965 and 2003. This accounts, so if you want to put this in like hours, this accounts for an additional and whopping 270 extra leisure hours per year. By 2040, the number of leisure hours in a typical day in the United States is projected to be about 7.2 hours, with just 3.8 hours of actual daily work. The numbers for other high-income countries are similar. Now, a little bit more about leisure time before we move on. In 1965, both the less educated and the more educated enjoyed about the same amounts of leisure time. But today, adults living in the United States without a high school diploma have 42% more leisure time than adults with a college degree. And that leisure time is usually during the work week. This is in large part due to underemployment or unemployment. And so when we think about leisure, yeah, we all want leisure time, but as with anything, too much of a good thing can be problematic. When we have too much free time, it may be easier for us to lean into those feel-good habits, behaviors, products that, again, make us feel good. I'm reminded of my episode I did on lagom, and I may be pronouncing that wrong, but lagom is the Swedish philosophy of living with just the right amount, not too much, not too little. I'll link to that episode as well in the show notes if you missed it. Okay, so we have way more leisure time than in the past. Another reason why we got here, of course, is that modern market forces, they are always working against us, aren't they? Let's talk about dieting for a minute. More than 15% of American homes are gluten-free at the moment. Some homes are gluten-free because people have celiac disease. Celiac disease, of course, is an autoimmune disease in which ingesting gluten damages the small intestine. But for other people, they are gluten-free because being gluten-free helps them limit their consumption of high-calorie, low-nutrition carbohydrates and other processed foods, right? So living gluten-free is a way of putting limits on our food consumption. Well, around 3,000 new gluten-free snack products were introduced in the United States in just 2 years, between 2008 and 2010, which just so happens to be right around the time in which gluten-free living as a lifestyle exploded. A gluten-free diet, which had once previously to 2008 been effective at limiting consumption of those high-calorie processed foods like the pizzas, the cookies, the crackers, it no longer does because modern market forces are working against us. Now, the rise of gluten-free, highly processed, ultra-processed foods, that's just one example. How about cigarettes? Cigarettes are largely taboo these days, for the most part, right? But market forces, instead of cigarettes, which are taboo and looked down upon, market forces introduced us to the vape pen. It's cool. All the cool kids are doing it. It's also highly addictive. Vape pens are cigarettes for the 21st century. And so those are just two examples in which the market sees a gap and inserts pleasure-eliciting products. We are, as a society, over-consuming. An overconsumption of anything, shopping, donuts, wine, heroin, whatever it is, it's bad for us. It's also bad for the planet, isn't it? The world's natural resources are rapidly diminishing. Economists estimate that by around the year 2040, which is just 16 years from now, the world's natural capital, which includes land, forest, fisheries, and fuels, will be 21% less in high-income countries and 17% less in poorer countries than today. Carbon emissions are expected to continue to grow by 7% in high-income countries and by 44% in the rest of the world. What am I saying? I'm saying that we are consuming ourselves. So when we talk about sustainability, of course, seeking to describe, to measure whether our current actions will create a livable planet for our children and grandchildren in the coming decades. So when we talk about sustainability and whether our current way of life is sustainable, the answer, of course, is no. Our lifestyle, our collective lifestyle, is not sustainable. We're depleting our natural world as we continue to seek out pleasure through the newest product or service to consume, tilt that seesaw towards pleasure and avoid pain. It is not sustainable, my friends. So we're going to take our ad break, but when we come back, we're going to talk about what we can do about it, to bring our own seesaws back to homeostasis. We'll get there after a quick sponsor break. Nothing nurtures the world above better than the soil below, and that's why I am so excited to introduce you to Coast of Maine. Coast of Maine is an organic soil brand that offers a full range of products designed to cover all of your garden and lawn needs. In years past, my vegetable garden, I neglected the soil and I didn't have much yield. If your soil lacks appropriate nutrients for success, your garden may not succeed. And so this year, I am so excited to cultivate the soil before planting the plants with Coast of Maine's organic products. Coast of Maine believes in nurturing relationships with local retailers. So next time you're at your local retailer, look for Coast of Maine products. Get growing. Visit coastofmaine.com to find a local retailer near you. coastofmaine.com. If you've been paying attention, you've likely heard something about gut health and why zoning in on your gut health is so darn important. You need EQ's Daily Women's Microbiome Defense. It's a 3-in-1 capsule that supports your digestive health and promotes gut barrier protection. I started taking EQ's Daily Women's Microbiome Defense because I have a bloating problem, friends. Yes, I do. Inflammation is not my friend. Since taking 1 capsule a day on an empty stomach with water, I have noticed more energy, improved skin, and here's the big one, reduced bloating. Head to myeq.com and use code SUSTAINABLE for 15% off Equilibria's microbiome defense and so much more. That's myeq.com and use code SUSTAINABLE at checkout for 15% off site-wide today. And we're back. On today's show, we're discussing the D word. Not that D word. We're discussing dopamine. We're discussing why, exactly why, what's happening in our brain. Why do we come back to our bad habits over and over again? That's what we did before the break. And now we're on to what can we do about it? So for some bad habits, you know the advice, right? Physical barriers, time limits, and categorical binding, right? So physical barriers mean lock up your phone if you have a cell phone addiction. Get the wine out of your house if you just can't stop drinking wine. Put geographical distance between you and your kryptonite. Beware, though, that in our world of plenty, it's easy to get around physical barriers if you really want to, of course, okay? But a physical barrier might work. Maybe a time limit will work. Maybe you are only drinking wine on weekends. That would be adding in a time limit. Or maybe even just tracking the amount of time you are doing something. Maybe you like to gamble. Maybe you just start by tracking the amount of time you're gambling. That will help you first become aware of your consumption so that you can then put limits on it. Know, though, that time has a real funny way of getting away from us when we're chasing dopamine. And of course, there's the categorical self-binding, which is you put limits on your dopamine-seeking behavior, your preferred dopamine-seeking behavior, by putting limits on categories of consumption. So If sports gambling is your Achilles heel, let's say, don't watch sports. Don't read the sports section of the newspaper. Don't listen to sports radios. It's about avoiding all the triggers of your preferred dopamine-inducing behavior, which of course is sports gambling. But yes, too, even categorical self-binding has some problems. It tends to backfire when we accidentally include a trigger in our daily lives. If there's so many triggers, you may find yourself triggered by one eventually. So what does more recent research say into the best ways to break these dopamine-inducing habits? Because let's not forget, what goes down must come up. If the seesaw, the pleasure-pain seesaw goes down and we engage in a dopamine-exciting behavior, the gremlins are going to come and jump on the pain side. So that means that with pleasure, we must then later also experience pain. So one suggestion, of course, is to take a break. Take a 30-day break. Go on a dopamine fast. You may remember that on this show, I often recommend for the aspiring minimalists to go on a 30-day shopping ban. You spend money on the necessities like rent, like your car payment, like gas, like food, but you don't go above and beyond and spend on extras. If shopping is your bad habit, there is a science-backed reason for going on a 30-day no-spend challenge. And that is that fasting from shopping in this case, but fasting from any of your habits, fasting from the dopamine that any of your habits gives you, allows the gremlins to jump off the seesaw. I'll say that another way. A dopamine fast allows your brain's pleasure-pain seesaw to recalibrate on its own. Imaging studies seem to back up the claim that for many bad habits, of course, not hard drugs, okay? I'm not talking about serious addictions here. I'm talking more about bad habits. But for a lot of bad habits, 4 weeks does seem to be the necessary amount of time for such recalibration to occur. 2 weeks is not enough. At 2 weeks, brains in these imaging studies are in a dopamine deficit state, which is to say that patients are still in dopamine withdrawal. And by the way, 4 weeks of abstinence, abstaining from your preferred bad habit, is really darn hard. It is no easy feat. And so if you're going to do it, take care to not replace one dopamine flooding habit with another. So if you're going on a 30-day no alcohol challenge, which I do like twice a year, because to be honest with you, wine is my bad habit. If you're going on a 30-day dry month, don't replace the alcohol with marijuana, let's say, because the goal is to recalibrate the seesaw, and the seesaw will not be recalibrated if you're flooding your brain with dopamine from cannabis. Now, the good news is that if you can abstain from your kryptonite, whatever it is, maybe it's eating candy on the couch after dinner, whatever it is, if you can abstain for 30-ish days, and yes, it's person specific. Some people need more than 30 days. Some people need less than 30 days. It's also drug specific. If you are addicted to opioids, 30 days likely won't do it. But if you can abstain from a bad habit for long enough, your brain may very likely readapt to the absence of the dopamine flood and rebalance. So the seesaw is going to even itself out. And once that seesaw is rebalanced, here's the great news. You will again take pleasure in small, everyday, simple rewards like watching the sunset, like going for a walk with a loved one. All these simple pleasures will again give you joy and pleasure naturally. So that's one idea. And I'll also say here too, if you or someone you know is very highly addicted to a substance, maybe it's alcohol, maybe it's an opioid, the brain may not go back to what it was before the usage of the drug. However, research does suggest that neural pathways can go around what doesn't recalibrate. So there's good news for everybody if we can just abstain. Another idea here too is to lean into pain. And I know you're thinking, what? I hate pain. I avoid pain at every turn. You're not alone. But just know that there is research that suggests that if you willingly tilt the seesaw towards pain, not a lot, don't go crazy, but if you tilt it slightly towards pain, remember that your brain likes equilibrium. So those gremlins will then jump on the side of pleasure. I'm going to say that another way. If you press on the pain side of the seesaw just a little bit, you may achieve a more enduring and longer lasting sense of pleasure. You've experienced this before. You know this is true. After you've been really sick, maybe you had the flu for a couple days, once you feel better, your mood is improved, right? Everything's brighter. Everything feels better. The world seems brighter, more welcoming, all the things. To my runners, what about the runner's high, right? The runner's high is nothing more than enduring a bit of pain during the exercise, which translates into euphoria post-run, right? How about jumping in the freezing cold ocean? The sun feels so much warmer once you get out, right? Now, speaking of the freezing cold ocean, hormesis is a branch of science that studies the beneficial effects of administering a small or moderate dose of painful stimuli. Keyword small or moderate, right? We're not cutting off our fingers, okay? Cold, heat, gravitational changes, radiation, food restriction, exercise. These are a couple ways in which we can add a little bit of pain into our lives so that we can experience more enduring and longer lasting moments of pleasure. Now, again, don't go overboard on the pain. Pain can, for some of us, become pleasurable. Pain can also become addictive. I'll just say too, this is not based in science, but this is based in Stephanie's life. I notice in my own life, so I love to exercise. I love to put my body through a little bit of pain. But I do notice a lasting effect on my mood when I exercise in the morning versus when I exercise in the afternoon or evening. And I wonder, I cannot prove this, but I wonder whether it has to do with the pleasure pain seesaw that I'm discussing right now with you today. When I put myself through a little bit of pain through exercise, whether it be lifting heavy weights or running or whatever it is, go through a little bit of pain, the pleasure, the after effect pleasure that I receive from that pain in the morning tends to last with me throughout the day. And again, I'm not sure whether it's this leaning into pain that we're discussing right now or whether it's due to other reasons, but I do feel as though when I exercise in the morning, I have a better mood throughout the day. And it doesn't work that way if I exercise at night. Okay, one more idea for you before we say goodbye, and that is to be honest about your habits. Be honest with someone. Maybe you confide in your priest. Maybe you talk honestly with your best friend. Maybe you go see a therapist. Maybe you write it in a journal. These are all ways to bring awareness to a bad habit or perhaps even an addiction that deep down you know you need to address, right? Bring the problem out into the light. We often don't want to talk about our own struggles with other people, right? We tend to assume that if we take off our masks, if we are fully honest with others, then the people we love will distance themselves from us. But the opposite is what happens more often. People come closer. Being vulnerable, being our true and authentic selves, has interpersonal benefits because other people, the people in our lives, see our own humanity when we're honest and when we're vulnerable. And when we're honest and vulnerable, we are reassuring the person we're talking to that they are not alone in their own weaknesses. This, of course, improves intimacy, which provides its own source of dopamine. To be more specific, I will just say that intimacy is largely related to the love hormone oxytocin. Oxytocin binds to receptors on the dopamine-secreting neurons in the brain's reward pathway and enhances the firing of the reward circuit tract. You don't have to know any of that. All you need to know is that oxytocin leads to an increase in brain dopamine. Be honest. Bring it out into the light. Talk with somebody else, if you have somebody in your life you can talk with. And I will say too, for parents who are raising children, perhaps even teenagers in this dopamine-flooded world, I suggest you be open and honest with your children about your own struggles, provided it's age appropriate, of course. Because if we're open and honest, we are creating space in which our children can also be open and honest with us. This, again, creates intimacy. And unlike the rush of dopamine we get from quick thrills, the rush we get from intimacy, hi there, oxytocin, that rush we get from intimacy is rejuvenating. It's health promoting. Let me also say here too, on the topic of children, every once in a while, one of you will email me and you'll say, oh, Stephanie, I shared your latest episode with my teenager. My teenager won't listen to me, but maybe they'll listen to you. If that sounds like your teenager right now, perhaps you share this episode with the teenagers in your life. Teenagers are especially susceptible to dopamine-inducing behaviors and products, right? Drugs, alcohol, cell phones, social media, all these and more. Maybe you share this episode with them. And if you did share this episode with them, to the teenagers listening, maybe you're scoffing at me right now and you're thinking to yourself, there's no pain on the seesaw after my go-to dopamine-inducing habit. I don't feel any pain. I just feel pleasure. And if that sounds like your experience, I would say good for you. Wonderful for you. What it's like to be youthful. I wish I was still a teenager. But don't get too comfortable, teenagers, because it will not always be the case. Young people tend to be more immune to the negative consequences, aka the pain part of that tilting seesaw. As we age, that's when the tipping point becomes more noticeable. Anyone who drank like a fish in college and still made it to class the next morning knows that when we're younger, we can pivot with our bad habits. But I can't drink like a fish anymore without staying in bed the entire next day. The entire next day. So teenagers, you may feel immune now, but ask yourself this very important question. Are you ready? Ask yourself, do you want to feed a bad habit now? Because it will eventually catch up with you. I can promise you that. I promise you it will catch up with you. So do you want to feed a bad habit? Perhaps create an addiction that you're just going to have to deal with later? Now, if you want to increase your dopamine, if you want to experience pleasure in your life, I mean, we all do. I don't mean to say that anything you do that feels pleasurable means, oh no, you're going to get it on the backside with pain. There are ways to experience pleasure without the drastic back and forth of the pleasure-pain seesaw. And these are just basic self-care activities that we all hear about all the time, but we don't do them, right? Like, how about eating good food, specifically eating foods that are rich in tyrosine? That's seeds, nuts, beans, lentils, cheese, and yes, meat. Also, up your magnesium intake. Magnesium's also in seeds, nuts, beans, and whole grains. Avoid processed foods. Avoid sugar and caffeine. Maybe not avoid them. I'm never going to avoid caffeine. But maybe instead of 3 cups of coffee every morning, I could go down to 1, right? Don't forget to get your proper sleep. Proper sleep is mandatory. It fuels dopamine production. So if you're not sleeping well, that needs to be number 1 on your to-do list. Get your sleeping right. Exercise daily. Yeah, you don't have to go run an ultra marathon, but get your body moving. Get your body moving. And finally, if you have excessive stress in your life, as we all do, but if you feel like yours is really excessive, perhaps we tackle the stress. Breathing exercises, meditation, therapy, whatever it is to address the stress, maybe you start there. And so my final word for us all today, myself included, I have so many bad habits, I don't even know where to start. But if you are using a bad habit to escape a negative feeling, know that the trick is to stop running away from the painful feeling that you're trying to avoid and instead give yourself opportunities to learn how to tolerate these feelings. We've all got these negative feelings. We've all got pain. Every single one of us. We must learn to tolerate it. And once we learn to tolerate it, we will then be rewarded with joy in the simple pleasures of life. So that is my show today. I hope you took something from it. If you did, please consider supporting the show, supporting my work, keeping the lights on with this labor of love. And thank you so much. We will be back on Thursday. I will see you then. Reach out if you need me, and take care.
You know how to book flights and hotels. All you're missing is a tool to plan the travel experiences you'll have once you arrive. That's why you need Viator. Book guided tours, excursions, and more in one place. There are over 300,000 travel experiences to choose from, so you can find something for everyone. And Viator offers free cancellation and 24/7 customer support for worry-free travel. Download the Viator app now and use code Viator10 for 10% off your first booking in the app. Find travel experiences for you. Do more with Viator.
Fargo, the new virtual assistant from Wells Fargo, makes banking faster and easier. Like this.
Fargo, what's my checking account routing number?
And this.
Fargo, turn off my debit card.
And this.
Fargo, what did I spend on groceries last month?
And that's just the beginning. Do you, Fargo? You can. In the Wells Fargo mobile app. Learn more at wellsfargo.com/getfargo.
Terms and conditions apply. Your mobile carrier's availability and message and data rates may apply. Wells Fargo Bank, N.A., member FDIC.